been another bad week for London, which has not only suffered a devastating fire in an apartment block, but also witnessed a third deliberate attack as a van drove into a crowd of people. What's behind the present state of London's misfortunes? And with the diplomatic storm over Qatar showing no signs of abatement, we'll be asking what America's position is towards this Gulf state in the wake of conflicting messages coming out of Washington. Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Tonight's show with all eyes on London. First, a so-called preventable fire leaving at least 79 people dead or missing, presumed dead. A terrible incident kills 1 and injures 8 as a van struck a crowd of pedestrians near a North London mosque. It's London's third terror attack involving a vehicle driving into pedestrians in just 3 months. The city is grief-stricken as disasters made by man and nature claim the lives of loved ones. With investigations into both incidents underway, we ask what has triggered the spate of UK terrorist incidents and what can be done to prevent these tragedies in the future, and what will it mean for the UK government, especially as it had just started the Brexit negotiations. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Tom Brooks, Dean of the Durham Law School at Durham University, and in the Midlands by Dr. Mike Finn, Deputy Head of the School for Cross-Faculty Studies at the University of Warwick. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Dr. Finn first, latest casualty estimate stands at 79, a very high toll, and in a Conservative borough, how much of a knock-on effect do you think this is going to have on Prime Minister Theresa May?
I think it's already had a significant effect on her. I think that following so soon after an election campaign where she was largely regarded as very impersonal, very aloof, unwilling to meet the public, her response to the disaster was initially characterised as very out of touch. You know, initially she refused to meet the residents in public view. The leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, did meet them, and she was criticised by a former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Michael Portillo, the other evening as just not displaying basic humanity. So within that narrative that's begun to form around Theresa, cold and distant, the response, rather than the fire itself, the response to the fire has created significant problems for her.
Professor Brooks, what do you think are the possible reasons behind her apparent indifference towards the suffering of the victims? I mean, she could have done something different this time right after the fire, for instance.
Yeah, well, I think the main problem that the Prime Minister has at the moment is that she is still in her ill-judged campaign mode. So during her election campaign, only recently ended, she was called by some Maybot that she sounded like a robot saying, "I'm going to be strong and stable leadership again and again and again." But one of the things that turned off some voters was they didn't see much that was strong and stable, and we're certainly not seeing anything like that now, whether it be on this disaster, the terrorist attack this morning, or leading into the Brexit negotiations. Strong and stable are not two words that we'd assign to her. And I think that her campaign strategy of having being surrounded only by select groups of supporters for some very good kind of photo ops that were fairly vacuous and light. I think she needs to get out of campaign mode fast. The election is over. She lost her majority but remains the leader of the largest party. And it's not just Jeremy Corbyn who is upstaging her. The Queen was out meeting victims the other day. It seems that everyone seems to be doing this better than she is. The Prime Minister can't stop things like this from happening, perhaps. But the real leadership is what happens afterwards, and there she's really failed on all measures.
Yeah, Dr. Finn, do you think Prime Minister May has reacted better after the Finsbury Park van attack this time? I mean, she immediately called an emergency meeting. Do you think she has learned from her mistakes after the fire?
Well, I think it's hard for her to do worse. I can only echo Tom's sentiments, really. You know, she's been stuck in this robotic mode where essentially she has only been prepared to give pre-scripted answers to questions, even if they weren't the questions she was actually asked. So I think the performance today, in light of, as you mentioned, calling an emergency meeting, in some senses, these are the kinds of things the Prime Ministers always do. When there's a terrorist attack, the Cobra Committee is called to meet. Essentially, an emergency meeting has been called today. She's, made known that she considers it to be a terrorist attack, which was something the police were criticised for in the early hours of this morning because they weren't clear on that. So she has made some moves today, but frankly, she's got a huge hill to climb. You know, she has done an enormous amount in the last 6 or 7 weeks to undermine any sense that she is a leader, frankly. And doing the bare minimum this morning is not going to be enough to turn that round very quickly, I would think.
Professor Brooks, but do you think this is fair for her? I mean, to what extent should she be held responsible for these incidents? Coming from the people who have been affected by these incidents have been very harsh. They called her cowardly, inhumane, murderer, and some other people calling her with blood on her hands. Aren't people overreacting a little bit as well?
Well, there's a lot of strong emotions that people will have, and prime ministers, whoever they are, will be subject to a lot of comments, both fair and... I think that no prime minister can promise that no attack can happen on people, but it's without any question that there is a real divisiveness in the country. I think that whatever one's views are on whether Britain should remain in the European Union, I think that the referendum campaign and how that was conducted was very fractious, and it brought division where there had not been. And I think that the country hasn't quite healed from that moment, and I think that it only in some sense got worse during the election campaign. Often we hear about extremists being only from one background and not others. It's fed into this narrative of dividing communities against each other that has, and trying to crack down more on the extreme speech of, say, extremist Islamic preachers, and not extreme right-wing hate speech in the same way, or at least not giving it the same emphasis. And I think that some of this is coming back to haunt her. Someone who saw herself as a very strong Home Secretary over many years, actually her record as Home Secretary is now coming to bite her, come back to harm her, now that she's Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, we were just seeing footage of people demonstrating on the streets of London calling for her resign. Dr. Finn, how do you think her low ranking is going to affect her chances of getting support from other political parties such as the DUP in order for her to govern?
Well, I think the DUP has its own reasons to support her. It has its own reasons to support the Conservatives. It wants to wield greater influence, obviously, in the UK and in Northern Ireland as a whole. It wants power. So I think, insofar as that's the case, I don't think it'll make a huge deal of difference to that. On the other hand, I think the knock-on effect of her crisis of leadership within the Conservative Party is significant. You know, the fact that after the election she very quickly moved to try to stick out an idea that there was a deal in place with the DUP. It transpired that there wasn't, was partly just to try and offset a coup within the Conservative Party. There are many Conservative MPs, notwithstanding the 1922 committee's meeting last week, who want Theresa May gone as fast as humanly possible. And I think these continual crises of leadership in respect to Grenfell, in respect potentially this morning, we'll have to see how that plays out, will damage it still further with those Conservative MPs. So I think a bigger issue, to be honest, than the DUP, than making an arrangement with them, is simply the arrangement she has to keep making with her own backbenchers, who've seen her fail spectacularly in an election campaign in the past few weeks and seen her essentially collapse as a brand in British politics. I think that's a bigger problem. I think in the medium term that's an insurmountable problem. I think that just means there's a question of time before she disappears. It doesn't necessarily mean the Conservative Party will fall from government, but I do think the days are numbered for Theresa May. It's just a question of when it ends.
Professor Brooks, do you share Dr. Finn's point of view here? How long do you think she's going to stay in power, and will the power be jeopardized?
I entirely agree with those remarks. I think Theresa May made the campaign quite literally all about her. those who received the Conservative Party's election materials, the Conservative Party logo was very hard to find. Theresa May's name was on the front and throughout. Who people's local candidate was often marginalized. And it was a victory, a landslide victory, that Theresa May's team thought she was going to win, and she wanted to own it, so to claim the full credit. But of course, that's not what happened. And of course, in making it all about her, when expectations were not met and fell far short, there's only one person who can get the blame for that, and that is her. I think it is a matter of time before she is out. I suspect it will be before the end of the year. I think she'll be lucky to make it to the party conferences this autumn.
Well, at this moment, we are seeing Brexit negotiations officially underway. Dr. Finn, will her damaged standing affect the negotiations, and in which way, if yes?
I think it will affect it at a domestic level. I'm not sure that it makes a huge deal of difference in relation to the actual negotiations themselves, because I think ultimately the European negotiators, the European partners, have been frustrated now for a year, that essentially it has been a year since the referendum almost, and it's only now that negotiations have begun, and largely that's attributable to various political decisions on behalf of the British, including this election. So whilst I think the Europeans are frustrated with that, I also think the Europeans have known their negotiating position for a very long time. So I don't think it'll affect that so much. What I think it will affect is her ability to command any sort of mandate for a particular kind of Brexit in the House of Commons. I don't think the election did speak clearly to any particular view on Brexit from the electorate. I think the election was about many more things than that. But it's, monumentally weakened her politically, which inevitably means that actors within Parliament, such as our own Chancellor Philip Hammond, who are known to be more sympathetic to quote-unquote softer Brexit, are strengthened, and that effectively means that she is weaker at home. So it does mean that the kind of rhetoric that she was coming out with only 7 or 8 weeks ago about a hard Brexit, about the no deal is better than a bad deal, it's not clear that she'll be able to pursue any of that now. And the ambiguity of the arrangement with the DUP, the need for some clarification on a soft border with Ireland, etc., I don't think it will change the negotiations from the European point of view, but I think it will change them from the British point of view domestically, and I think it changes fundamentally the kind of character of any kind of Brexit the British government is trying to pursue.
Yeah, finally, before we go, Professor Brooks, what's your take on this?
Well, I think to some degree I agree with that, though I'd be a bit, perhaps even more critical. I think that with the European partners, the decision of the British public to leave the European Union has already been made, and the general election doesn't really affect that as such. But it's also the case that Theresa May is not getting a majority in Parliament has meant that whatever plan she had is not genuinely workable. And it's also the case that even as late as Friday, the government had still not sent its original position papers to its negotiating partners for this morning's meeting. That is to say, the general outline of what Britain wanted out of negotiations was not set out even in outline. Less than 1 working day before the negotiations start. Right. And this suggests to me very much this is a government that's not only lost its authority at home, but it's lost it abroad as well.
Well, they definitely had a lot of things in their hands to do. Well, many thanks, Professor Tom Brooks, Dean of the Durham Law School at Durham University, and Dr. Mike Finn, Deputy Head of the School for Cross-Faculty Studies at the University of Warwick. And my first point here, the fallout from the incidents this past week in which 79 were presumed dead after the fire in West London and the 4th terrorist attack in the UK this year could be much greater than at first appeared. With the personal attacks on Theresa May having been stepped up, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't really matter, then politicians from other parties such as the DUP are less likely to want to form an alliance with a weak Prime Minister, while if the Conservative Party is finally forced into going to the country for yet another election, that is bound to affect the Brexit negotiations, especially if there is a change of power, a change of party in power. This is turning out to be not just an annus horribilis for the Conservative Party, but a challenging time for the UK as a whole. What is clear is there are a lot more fallout from these seemingly unrelated incidents. The diplomatic crisis in which several countries cut ties with Qatar has turned to its third week. In contrast with the start of the crisis, when US President Donald Trump accused Qatar of being a founder of terrorism at a very high level, the US and Qatar have just signed an agreement worth $12 billion for F-15 fighter jets, as well as conducting a joint military exercise. Is the American attitude towards Qatar changing, or were Trump's initial statements just misinformed? I'm pleased to be joined in Tel Aviv by Mr. Mayor Javdan Far, a Middle East analyst, and in Washington, D.C. by Gerald Feinstein, former U.S. ambassador to Yemen. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Ambassador Feinstein, now the U.S. and Qatar just signed the $12 billion agreement for F-15 fighter jets. Even though the deal is a long time in the making, surely the U.S. could have delayed it if they wanted to do. Why do you think they declared this cooperation at this particular moment?
Well, I think that the issue of possible delay in the announcement of the sale was certainly something that the administration looked at, but I think that the decision to go forward signaled that indeed the United States remains committed to the bilateral relationship with Qatar, and that we continue to value our bipartisan or binational cooperation with Qatar on security and defense issues. So this was an important sale. It's been in the works, as you said, for quite a long time, and the decision was made that we should proceed as normal.
Mr. Javdan Far, how do you look at this apparently conflicting signal coming out of Washington, D.C.? Do you think it's an opportunistic move by the United States?
I think it's very realistic, to be honest with you. The United States, despite the fact that President Trump supported the Saudis, and he has much better Saudis, based by his statements, he has much better relations with the Saudis than the Qataris, but at the same time he cannot ignore Qatar. Qatar is host to US Central Command, Air Force Central Command, where it has 110,000 US forces there. And also Qatar is an important partner in terms of buying US weapons, and also in security partner for the United States in the area. So I think despite the rhetoric that we hear from the White House, the US security establishment is taking a very realistic approach towards this, towards the current tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And despite the president taking sides, the rest of the administration, the US and the security establishment, is trying relations with Qatar, because they know that one day these tensions are going to be over, and they don't want to be on the losing side.
Ambassador Feinstein, now a joint naval exercise by the US and Qatari troops in the Gulf has just finished. Now 2 US Navy vessels participated. What do you think is the purpose and significance of this drill?
Well, there was a bit of a disagreement between the Qataris and the Pentagon about the nature of the US Navy engagement over the last few days, where the Qataris termed it as a military exercise. The Pentagon put out a statement saying that it was really just a routine port visit, as we conduct with all of our friends and partners in the Gulf. So I wouldn't overestimate the significance of that. It was, again, possibly quite a routine visit, and something that we do on a regular basis. These visits, these port calls, are something that is, generally speaking, prepared months or even years in advance. So it was again, I think, a sign that the United States is proceeding in its security relationship with Qatar as business as usual.
Mr. Javdan Far, now given the US's large military base in Qatar, as you rightfully pointed out, it's actually not affordable for the United States to be antagonist towards the ruling family there. However, US President Donald Trump was clearly picking sides and making it very clear where his position was concerning the issue of cutting diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Why do you think President Trump did that, and right before he's about to announce the the F-15 fighter jet sales?
I think that's an excellent question, and one which is difficult to answer. The President of the United States, in similar scenarios, when two of its key allies are in a state of tensions like this, should do his best in order to create a rapprochement and a solution, not add fuel to the fire as President Trump did. This is, I think, the best answer I could give you is that President Trump has proved himself to be very inexperienced when it comes to the issues relating to foreign policy. He made a statement, it seems perhaps it was off the cuff. Of course, maybe the United States has some issues with Qatari behavior. However, Twitter is not the place to go and express your views, especially not in 140 characters when it comes to something as complicated as the current issue between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So I think at best I can put it down to inexperience, and I'm sure there are many within the US government and US defense establishment that are hoping and praying that this is the last time the president takes such a damaging stance to the interest of the United States.
Ambassador Feinstein, what is your take on this? Basically, as we have also found out that Secretary of State Tillerson was working hard to call on both sides of the conflict to stay calm, to cool down, to work this out, while President Trump was being very harsh and taking side. What do you think is the possible explanation of what we just experienced?
Well, I agree with your other guest. I think that this was a reflection of inexperience on the part of the White House team, not only the president, but some of the people who are around him, that they had had a very successful visit by the Deputy Prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, have worked out very close relationships with some of the principals in the United Arab Emirates. And I think that their first instinct was to be supportive of their friends without really thinking through the implications of the issue. Whereas in the State Department and the Defense Department, you had people who understood the potential consequences of allowing this problem to fester. This isn't a new issue. This is a problem that's gone on for a number of years. The United States has always had a policy of trying to encourage our friends and partners in the region to work through their issues through negotiation, through dialogue, and the first instinct in state and defense was to go back to that traditional role that the United States has played. I think that what we've seen over the course of this period is that gradually the White House is being brought into line with the State and Department experts, and we've seen, I think, a decline in the desire on the part of the White House to really push a position that is at variance with the U.S. traditional role.
Mr. Jeff Denfar, it's interesting to see the reaction of regional countries towards this crisis, especially lately the action of Turkey. Now, Turkey has stood out among those helping to negotiate a way through the crisis. It condemned the blockade against Qatar and has sent food. Now, the latest news is that Turkish troops arrived in Qatar for a military exercise on Sunday. Are we seeing a further polarization of Sunnis and Shiites in the region, you think?
Well, Qatar itself is a Sunni state, so is Saudi Arabia. I think it's going beyond that. I think the paradigm I'd like to use for the conflict between the current tensions between the Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the more important and more powerful paradigm is state sovereignty versus regional solidarity. Qatar wants to exercise its own sovereignty. It wants to carry out policies that sees to its own interests. Of course, some other countries in the region, the 6 members of the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, they disagree with it. They expect Qatar to act in terms of regional solidarity when it comes to issues such as Iran and Syria. But it seems that for now the Qataris are going to practice state sovereignty, their own state interests, putting that before that of regional solidarity, and that's going to have implications when it comes to Syria. Let's not forget that the conflict in Syria took one step closer to becoming even more conflict. The United States shot down a Syrian aircraft, and now the Russians have said that they are going to shoot any allied aircraft they see over the skies of Syria. This means that finding a solution for the Qatar tensions is now become even more urgent.
Ambassador Feinstein, what is your take at this? What do you think is the fallout of the diplomatic crisis between Saudi Arabia and its friends against Qatar going to have on the conflict in Syria?
Well, it's hard to say, and I would say that one thing that we're hearing from our friends in Doha is that they intend to step up their cooperation with the coalition in Syria, that they intend to engage militarily in a way that they haven't over these past months because of their commitments to support the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And so I think that one of the things that we're going to see going forward is that the Qataris are actually going to use this conflict as a way of solidifying their relationships, not only with the United States, but with other key partners, European and more broadly in the region. You mentioned the Turks earlier. I think that it will strengthen the Qatari relationship with Turkey, and they are going to try to use this as a way of isolating and marginalizing the Saudis and the Emiratis. But most importantly, I think that it is critical that we find a way of diffusing this crisis as quickly as possible to avoid doing damage to U.S. and regional broader interests, not only in Syria but also in Yemen, and also in terms of the effort to confront Iranian behavior in the region.
Many thanks to the two gentlemen joining us today, Gerald Feinstein, former U.S. ambassador to Yemen, and Mr. Maya Javdan Far, a Middle East analyst based in Israel. Now, here is my last point. America's mixed signals appear to be throwing up as many questions as it does answers, but through the analysis of our guests, we have come to understanding the situation a bit better. However, the row over Qatar is perhaps in reality also about how major powers can ensure they get a share of the huge natural gas reserves that lie underneath the desert in the Gulf Sheikhdom. Since 2006, Qatar has been the biggest LNG exporter in the world, and they have been an important source of gas for countries in both Asia and in Europe. Whatever political rhetoric these countries might come up with, the fact is they need energy to be able to drive their own economies. That one fact often speaks louder than words in determining foreign policy. And that's all for this edition of The Point with Millie Sheen. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the